Good afternoon, everybody. Good middle of the night, wherever you are elsewhere. My name is Melissa Freeman, and I'm going to be actually just saying a few things before I turn it over to Stephanie Jones. Stephanie Jones, our fearless leader, couldn't be with us in person today, but she is online on Zoom, and will be giving the introduction and introduce everybody via the Zoom. This is the second lecture of our 2024-2025 lecture series. And I just want to let you know a little bit about how we're going to handle the questions for tonight, for today. Sorry. And if you're in the room, there are index cards kind of circulating around, and you can jot down your questions and just move them forward. And if you're on Zoom, you just use the chat function and your questions will get handled that way. I'm going to now just turn it over to Stephanie, who will study and the lecture for today.
Thank you, Melissa, and good afternoon, everyone. I am Stephanie Jones, and I'm delighted to welcome you back to the second lecture of an exciting series given by Professor Betty St.Pierre. I'm joining via Zoom today because I have COVID and don't want to expose anyone to this continuously mutating and sometimes life-threatening virus. The virus is but one small reminder that humans are not autonomous beings, but rather beings that are in constant relation with forces and actants outside the permeable boundaries of our bodies that often make their way inside our bodies one way or another. It's the inside-outside binary that's troubling, isn't it? As we gather in Athens, Georgia, in the United States, and welcome guests on Zoom in many countries around the globe, all across the globe, we're so happy you're all joining with us today. I want to begin by acknowledging the power and importance of place, land, and labor. The University of Georgia is located on the traditional ancestral territory of Muskogee-speaking and Cherokee peoples, as well as other Native communities who were forcibly removed from their homelands. The lands occupied by the university throughout the state were the places of lived relationships, learning, ceremony, and resistance. We recognize these Native peoples as the original caretakers who continue to pass on their histories and traditions, sustaining connections to their ancestral lands and waters. We are able to be here today due in part to the labor of enslaved people of African descent who helped to build the university, and the ongoing daily labor of many people whom students and even faculty sometimes rarely see. I want to acknowledge, first of all, Jeff Reeder and Michael Weisenbaker, who are in the room with you if you're in person today. They are our audiovisual and technology experts, and this doesn't happen without them. And our fabulous graduate students, Floor, Sunja, Lee, Melissa, Lindsay, Amos, Maria, Vanessa, Reed, and Jay. Thank you all. My amazing UGA colleagues, Melissa Freeman and Hillary Hughes, and I have worked with colleagues from The Ohio State University, North Carolina State University, the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, University of Alabama, and Gardner-Webb University to make this series a reality. The series is supported at UGA by the Institute for Women's Studies, the Graduate School, the Mary Frances Early College of Education, the Interdisciplinary Qualitative Studies Program, the Red Clay Writing Project, as well as the University of Alabama, North Carolina State, and Ohio State. I want to thank each of you for joining us today in person and via Zoom. We are coming together just 10 days after the historic Hurricane Helene ripped through the southeastern part of the United States. Another not so small reminder that humans are not autonomous beings, but in constant relation with actants and forces beyond human. This hurricane has ravaged many parts of the southern part of the United States, and specifically the southeast where we are located. Our city of Athens was largely spared as the eye of the storm traveled directly over us. But our neighbors to the northwest, north, and east have been beyond devastated. Many still have no power, internet, gasoline, transportation, running water, medications, oxygen, and many have lost everything to horrific and historic floods and landslides, including their beloved family members and friends who have perished in some of the most heartbreaking way. Many of these places are still cut off entirely from outside towns and only accessible by helicopter, small plane, small boats, horseback, or kayaks. It is not an overstatement that these communities are living in apocalyptic times that are getting worse with every passing day. This is one version of a map of North America. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I want to point out where the Appalachian Mountains are. And Athens, Georgia sits just right in the foothills, the southern foothills of that mountain range. Philosopher Rosie Braidotti tells us that we are living in the post-human convergence, the convergence of late-stage capitalism, climate crises, accelerating technologies, and ever-widening wealth, income, and resource gaps. Hurricane Helene is one such convergence. We have people connected to this lecture series who are personally affected by this tragedy. And many of you, even joining us today, might be affected as well. Jessica Van Cleve at Gardner-Webb University has shared about the devastation to the community of Boiling Springs, North Carolina. And Alicia Jackson, who is an invited scholar for this series and will join us in January for lecture number 4, is at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. That's 500 miles from the coast and higher than 3,000 feet in elevation. The hurricane devastation in Boone, North Carolina is catastrophic. Alicia is safe in doing what she can to support her community. The need across the entire region is unfathomable. Some geologists are beginning to say the mountains have been resurfaced. And Hurricane Helene was a geological event that will be marked in the mountains, valleys, rivers, and streams. I want to show you that this is a map from last night. Landslides are being tagged in real time and interactive maps that people have access to wherever they are. If you are moved to help in any way, and if you're able to donate even a small amount of money, we want to offer you a way to do that. There will be a link to mutual aid disaster relief in the Zoom chat if you would like to make a donation. And now a lesson about why we need to understand empiricism. The Appalachian Mountains are one of the oldest and most biodiverse mountain systems in the world. Our Southern Appalachians is a beloved region, land, and people, cared for by indigenous people for millennia, and today by the Eastern Band of Cherokee in Western North Carolina. The mountains are also cared for by generations of mountain people, Appalachian folks, many of whom have endured persistent and damaging negative stereotyping and discrimination on top of generations of labor exploitation and mountaintop removal by corporate mining. Research, empirical research, carried out by social scientists, education scholars, economists, and other academics, not only produce these devastating and dehumanizing representations of Appalachia and its people, but they have continued to produce research that perpetuates a, quote, culture of poverty that has been critiqued extensively by Appalachian studies and post-structural scholars, but the stories still persist. These persistent stories about people and places travel far beyond the halls of academia, entangling with popular discourse, fueling social imagination, and affecting the way Appalachian people themselves, ourselves, make sense of our lives. Take, for example, a New York Times bestselling book called Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir of family and culture in crisis, written by Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance. While many people find the book hopeful and uplifting, it is a book that reproduces every single stigma that Appalachia has been fighting against for decades. Vance's seemingly internalized hatred of poor people, Appalachian culture, his own family, and his yearning to attain a version of success idealized in a neoliberal capitalist society is written throughout the book. Vance, like so many people who read his book, thinks with a humanist empirical science that he likely doesn't even realize exists. Indeed, because Vance writes about his own life, a conventional qualitative social science practice might be to call it the truth. Or as Betty reminds us, empiricists might say, quote, let the facts speak for themselves, as if anything presented as fact exists outside of interpretation. Vance might even be considered a prized participant in a research study about white urban Appalachian people who have experienced upward mobility through education. And perhaps even without realizing what they are doing or how it became possible, a qualitative scholar might draw the same conclusions that Vance draws himself. Appalachian folks are poor and discriminated against because they are lazy, susceptible to addiction. They don't work hard enough. They have a problem with authority and simply aren't willing to leave their families and communities in order to, quote, better themselves. This hypothetical qualitative scholar might validate these findings by doing member checks, coding data, triangulating data across interviews or narratives and existing literature, which would be very easy given the prevalence of deficit discourses circulating about Appalachia. They might write a subjectivity statement, and they may even say that they did not expect a participant to speak so negatively about their own marginalized and exploited communities, but that scholar might feel compelled to report it because they need to give their participants voice and power. They might claim rigor because of the length of interviews or the number of participants or the length of time that a study endured. And they might never once consider that what they are carrying out is a humanist, positivist research study rooted in a conventional social science empiricism that can and does perpetuate injustice. As Betty St.Pierre tells her readers and students often, you have been theorized. Your job is to figure out how you've been theorized and decide if that's what you want. And if it's not what you want, change it. All social scientists have been theorized, and perhaps most are theorized into a philosophy of science that is patriarchal, white supremacist, colonial, neoliberal, capitalist, and imperialist, and they don't even realize it. In this philosophy of science, it makes sense to listen to Vance's narratives that reproduce devastating injustices for Appalachian places and people, accept them as truth, and feel compelled to publish them as such, letting the, quote, data speak for itself. This is a grave error. It's one that is facilitated by a lack of understanding the philosophical assumptions that are already operating in their research and they don't even know exist, such as a human subject that is bound, individualized, and autonomous. Language as truth and representative of reality, power as a relatively static force, and agency as human will. The posts, however, and specifically post-structural feminisms as described in Betty's paper titled Post-Structural Feminism in Education, call all of this certainty into question. She writes that, quote, post-structural feminists believe that the comfort of imagined absolutes and deep structures allows us to avoid responsibility. Post-structuralism does not allow us to blame elsewhere, outside of our own daily activities, but it demands that we examine our own complicity in the maintenance of social injustice, my apologies. She reminds us that, quote, we are ethically bound to pay attention to how we word the world. We must pay attention to humanism's desire for unity, coherence, totality, and equilibrium. In her detailed and brilliant work across 30 years, Betty shines a flashlight in the dark box of philosophy of science and the making of empiricisms that most of us don't even realize we are working inside. Graduate students show up to qualitative research courses and learn what they are presented with. And too frequently, programs neglect the teaching of philosophy and theory and rush too quickly to application of methods. Betty shows us how methods and methodologies presented as if they are neutral tools used for discovering truth are not neutral at all, but they are actants, they are forces, they come preloaded with assumptions about the human subject, power, agency, language, truth, ontology, epistemology, ethics, indeed, what it means to do empirical research. Vance's narratives that reproduce Appalachia and Appalachian people as deviant, immoral, and a hellhole to escape become unintelligible when thinking with post-structuralism that requires us to ask things like, how is power operating here? Who benefits from the reproduction of these stories? What discourses are circulating in the language used? And what kind of human subject is being produced? Where is agency located, and more? Our collective imagination about Appalachia shifts profoundly when we think with the posts, and many scholars have done and continue to do this creative and critical work. Queer Appalachian environmentalism, Appalachian food, language, and land justice projects, histories of granny women providing health care to include birth control, abortion, and births using herbal, energy, and spirit medicine, theater and arts projects in communities and prisons, novels and studies exploring the role of corporate capitalism in the opioid and heroin epidemic. A new, vibrant, different Appalachia emerges through this work that rejects the fundamentals of empiricism. About 10 years ago, Betty walked into my office. Can you imagine that I have been next door neighbors in our offices with Betty for more than a decade, my lucky fortune. She walked into my office with a pile of books in her arms, and without saying, hello, how are you doing? How's your day? She just looked at me and said, no one studies empiricism. And I looked at her and said something along the lines of, that sounds about right, including me. So I'm glad you are, and you can fill me in. I had the privilege of watching her and listening to her as she was immersed in the deep study of empiricism to write the publication that was recommended for today's lecture. And while Betty would prefer that we all read all of those books on our own, she does an exceptional job of articulating a history of the philosophy of science to give us a good starting point for understanding how we have been theorized, so we can decide if we like it or if we want something different. Please help me welcome my dear friend and mentor, a native of North Carolina, a Southern American scholar who continues to shift and reshape what becomes possible to think, do, speak, and imagine, Professor Betty St.Pierre.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you all for coming today. I want to thank Stephanie as well as the committees of faculty, students, and technology experts whose work make this lecture series possible. And I'm so very happy that one of our College of Education's former students, already an accomplished scholar at The Ohio State University, Dr. Sophia Zhang, is here with us today. And we're excited to meet her colleague, Dr. Sarah Lynn McKinnon-Crawley, who's at Baylor University. I think those of you who attended their workshop this morning will agree they're a powerhouse. Before I talk about the topic of today's lecture, empiricism, I want to repeat some key points about qualitative inquiry, post-qualitative inquiry I made in the first lecture on September 9. First and most important is that post-qualitative inquiry begins with post-structuralism, its concepts and its ontology of immanence. So you must study post-structuralism if you want to do post-qualitative inquiry, just as you have to study chemistry if you want to be a chemist. I believe it takes years of reading to begin to understand the work of those scholars we now call post-structural, just as it takes years of study to understand any new body of knowledge like physics, anatomy, horticulture, economics, or sociology. Each field has invented its theories and its concepts, which aren't jargon. They're the language that organizes and differentiates the field, the language that must be learned. Philosophy is no different. Particular philosophies, theories, and concepts have normalized us and the world we live in now, the world we take for granted. We say, everybody knows this is just the way it is. But post-structuralism helped me understand there have been and are different descriptions which might enable different lives and different worlds. The first task then of someone who wants to understand post-qualitative inquiry is to study post-structuralism. The second is to understand that post-qual is not another pre-existing humanist empirical social science research methodology like those we often see strung together in a sentence: quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, experimental, and so on. Nor is post-qual a version of qualitative methodology, qualitative research with a rhizome or an assemblage thrown in. Because post-qualitative inquiry is immanent, it cannot exist, but is always coming into existence. That means there can be no pre-existing research designs and methods that tell you what to do and when to do it. For that reason, every post-qualitative study will be different. Third, post-qualitative inquiry does not reject qualitative methodology. It's just something different altogether. With that review in mind, I want to shift now to my journal article, which is the focus of today's lecture, The Empirical and the New Empiricisms, which was published in 2016, and talk about the origin of that paper. That journal article is part of a special issue of the journal Cultural Studies Critical Methodologies on New Materialisms and New Empiricisms. My wonderful colleagues, Alicia Jackson and Lisa Matzey, who will be here with us in January, and I edited that special issue. We've been reading quite a lot about new materialism, but I was especially intrigued by a lovely paper by a feminist sociologist whose work I've been following for years, Patricia Clough. The title of her paper is The New Empiricism, Affect and Sociological Method. I hadn't found much else in the literature on new materialism about empiricism, but clearly one concept is imbricated with the other, and in traditional Western epistemology, both belong to the world of the senses and lived experience rather than to the world of the mind. I wasn't sure whether the new materialisms accepted Descartes' mind, matter, mind, body, rational, empirical, epistemological binary. As the papers for the special issue came in and we reviewed them, I realized none of the authors had really addressed empiricism in their discussions of materialism. I also realized I had never studied empiricism, though I'd taken and taught many courses on qualitative research methodology. Wondering where our students at the University of Georgia study empiricism, I decided to search our university's course bulletin and found only one course with the word empiricism in either the course title or its brief description. And it was an undergraduate philosophy course on the British empiricists. Well, that makes sense because empiricism is a philosophical concept which is set against rationalism in epistemology. I'll talk more about that later. But what was so surprising was that I couldn't find empiricism in our courses in the social sciences, which are charged with doing empirical research. You know, the old adage goes that philosophers think and social scientists do empirical research. They collect data in the real world to support their claims. They don't just engage in philosophical speculation. There's that old theory practice binary at work. But I'd never studied empiricism. And how could I understand the new empiricism if I'd never studied the old empiricism? In the rush to application, to the doing, always to the doing, always to what do I do now, I never studied the theory that enabled the practice. But there's a name for privileging practice over theory, practicalism. But application practice is always normed by theory. Once you have a new theory to think with, you'll not only see the world differently, you'll do things differently. For example, after being taken up by feminism, there are things I can never say or do again. In 1988, Bogdan and Bicklin, who wrote an early popular textbook about qualitative methodology, described methodology as the theory of knowledge and the interpretive framework that guide a research project. And they describe methods as specific techniques used in a project that must align with its methodology. As I explained in my September 9 lecture in my dissertation research, rather than think about whether qualitative methodology could even be thought in post-structuralism, I rushed to pre-existing qualitative methods, to procedures and techniques like interviewing that didn't align with post-structuralism. In other words, I just skipped over post-structuralism's theory of knowledge, its epistemology, its rational and or empirical assumptions. Actually, those scholars we call post-structural were suspicious of the entire epistemological project, and I knew that. But procedure, technique, and method won out in my dissertation research, and I rushed to application, to the doing. So the special issue on new materialisms and new empiricisms was an opportunity for me to finally study empiricism, which is always linked to materialism. But think about this. I had begun to study qualitative methodology and empirical social science research methodology in 1991. And I finally wrote about empiricism in 2016, 25 years later. How could that happen? I wondered if others were teaching and learning the history and politics of empiricism in their methodology courses. In any event, I knew I had to catch up, which meant I had to read a lot. Even though I had studied logical empiricism some years before when it resurfaced to control educational research in the No Child Left Behind Act of 2000, I knew there was more to empiricism than just logical empiricism. After all, in Western thought, empiricism began with the sophists in ancient Greece. And in the 1600s, during the Western Enlightenment's scientific revolution, it was championed by Francis Bacon and then by John Locke and David Hume, those British empiricists our philosophy students are studying. And lest we think empiricism is scientific and objective, I want to remind us that it's always already political, as a post-colonial scholar, Edward Said, warned when he wrote about philosophers who will conduct their discussions of Locke, Hume, and empiricism without ever taking into account that there is an explicit connection in these classic writers between their philosophic doctrines and racial theory, justifications of slavery, or arguments of colonial exploitations. Empiricism then is always already historical and political, and it is not innocent. As I read, I quickly learned that empiricism is just too big and that I could only begin to study it for my paper for the special issue. So I focused on the two approaches I found prevalent in much social science research. Logical empiricism, whose goal is to unify science by using the methods of the natural sciences to study the social sciences in order to invent a social science as perfect as physics. And the very different empiricism of phenomenology, which refuses logical empiricism and focuses on the subjective experience of everyday life. Now, the post-structural scholars I've studied refuse both logical empiricism and phenomenology for different reasons, but I don't have time to discuss that today. Deleuze and Guattari, however, introduced a different empiricism, transcendental empiricism, which I'm not sure I understand, though I keep working at it. And in the end, I decided to write about logical empiricism, phenomenology, and transcendental empiricism in my paper. I began by doing what and I'm sure you do. I found encyclopedia articles. I'm a librarian. I found encyclopedia articles, journal articles, and books on empiricism and began to read. And I'm going to switch gears now and talk for a bit about how reading works in my scholarship and how it leads to writing at some point. I described that process in detail in a recent journal article called Reading for Post Qualitative Inquiry, but I'll be brief here today. When I was a new doctoral student studying feminist theory, critical race theory, Marxist theory, post-structural theory, and others, I just didn't understand what the words meant. I knew that scholars invent new concepts for their theories. For example, Freud invented the new concepts ego, id, superego. Marx invented base, superstructure, and surplus labor. But ordinary words were confusing me. As an English teacher, I thought I knew what the word subject meant, the subject of a sentence, the actor that precedes the action, the doer before the deed, but clearly I didn't. I thought I knew what words like discourse, agency, freedom, truth, knowledge, justice, reason, and so on meant. But as soon as I thought I understood them, I'd read something else and the meaning slipped away. I was lost in language and really struggling, not sure I could handle doctoral level work. Actually, I was getting a glimpse of something really, really important, that different theories and theorists describe existing concepts differently. That, as Derrida later taught me, meaning cannot be contained and closed off into word. After all, a word is just a word. For example, justice and freedom in Foucault are not the same as justice and freedom in Marx or Crenshaw. Here's an example of this confusion. After my September 9 lecture, someone asked a familiar question: where's social justice in post-structuralism and in post-qual? And my answer is that it's everywhere, but it looks different. It looks different. And you have to read post-structuralism to learn that difference. But back to my angst and confusions with language as a doctoral student. I was at my wit's end when my training as a librarian finally kicked in, and I began to compile what I call Betty's Dictionary, a Word document, which is now about 900 single-space pages long. It's a compilation of quotations from texts I've read and is organized alphabetically by concept. There must be hundreds of entries in my dictionary of quotations. Nothing in it is original. In other words, I haven't written my own descriptions or interpretations of concepts. It contains only quotations from other texts. In teaching, I call my dictionary a reading management strategy and encourage students to create their own versions to capture their reading so they don't lose it and will have access to it years later. It's highly unlikely you'll be able to find again that wonderful sentence from Barad or Bakhtin once you close the book and put it on the shelf. So how does this work? Well, I'm a slow reader because as I read, I type into my dictionary words, phrases, sentences, sometimes whole pages from text I'm reading that are related to a concept. I also include the bibliographic reference for each quotation. My entry on the concept deconstruction is about 10 pages long. My entry on subject, which has been a key concept in all my work, is about 20 pages. I don't mind the typing, copying a beautiful phrase or sentence, writing it again, saving it. Often I read an entire entry before I add a new quotation to it. The concepts dig in and overtake as I think and work. When I began to focus on Deleuze's work, I created a second dictionary, Betty's Deleuze Dictionary, about 600 pages long now, because I couldn't just drop Deleuze and Guattari's radically different concepts in my other dictionary. They didn't fit. And that lack of fit taught me something about specificity of conceptual orders. When I began reading about new materialism and new empiricism, and again found new and different concepts, I began a third dictionary. On that topic that's about 100 pages long. I also maintain what I call a master reference list with all the bibliographic references for the quotations in my dictionaries and my publications. It's about 130 pages long. I understand now, finally, that my scholarship has always focused to a great extent on the concepts we have to think and live with, on new concepts and redescriptions of old concepts. As early as 2000, I wrote a paper, Post-Structural Feminism in Education, to help me understand how ordinary concepts like justice, freedom, agency, language, discourse, rationality, reality, the subject, and so on, are described differently in what I call Enlightenment humanism and post-structuralism. And I relied on the reading I'd captured in my dictionary to write that early paper. More recently, I've used my dictionaries to write journal articles on empiricism, which is the focus of today's lecture, on positivism, which I'll discuss today as well, and on immanence and hexiety, concepts I'll discuss in other lectures in this series. For me, writing begins with reading and dictionary work. When I began to study empiricism, I didn't have much about it in my dictionary. That told me something. But I ended up with 20 single-spaced pages. I could have read for years, but I had a deadline, so I had to stop reading and start writing. The first thing I did was print my entry on empiricism and study it like any other text. I brought that printed entry with me today so you could see it. Pages filled with quotations, marked with many tabs on the sides, highlighted with many notes in the margins. This is where my paper on empiricism began. And of course, this began with all the reading. I read and reread that dictionary entry, went back to original sources and reread them, and decided how to organize the paper and started to write. But my single dictionary entry on empiricism wasn't enough, because conventional empiricism is said to exist in Descartes' rational empirical binary, which separates the mind and the body and organizes epistemology, the study of knowledge. Rationalists like Descartes rejected the empirical, the unstable, unreliable, messy, contingent, unpredictable, and therefore uncontrollable world of the senses, the empirical world of experience. To produce true knowledge, the rationalist must not allow his mind to be contaminated by his body's unreliable senses. In that way, Descartes established the mind-body binary, and then others that follow from it, the binaries man-nature, man-woman, objective, subjective, rational, irrational, and so on. So the conventional understanding of empiricism is that it's an epistemological project, a theory of knowledge set in opposition to rationalism. But Deleuze's transcendental empiricism isn't an epistemological project. In fact, Deleuze seldom uses the word epistemology in his work. So we can't assume empiricism will stay put in the category epistemology where it's traditionally been assigned. But there's more. Because conventional empiricism claims to produce true knowledge based on the evidence of experience in the real material world out there somewhere, you also have to study experience and materiality and reality, concepts that take you to ontology, the study of what exists and how what exists is divided up. Empiricism then isn't just an epistemological project, it's also ontological. As you follow the trail of very different descriptions of those ancient concepts, empiricism, rationalism, epistemology, experience, materiality, reality, ontology, and so on, you might begin to wonder if Descartes got it wrong and Deleuze got it right, or maybe Whitehead did, or Spinoza. At any rate, you begin to understand that empiricism, like everything else, is historical and contingent, and as I said earlier, always political. And there are just too many different descriptions of empiricism in different conceptual orders to get to the bottom of it. Actually, if you try to understand empiricism, if you press on it, it will stutter and shiver and just fly off. For that reason, I've had to constantly rein in my paper on empiricism, lest it go off in all sorts of directions. To stay on track within the word limits of the paper, I had to pretend it's just a paper about empiricism and not also about entire historical and political conceptual orders that organize systems of thought which can be incommensurable. The incommensurabilities of different systems of thought take me to Thomas Kuhn, a philosopher and historian of the natural sciences, whose book, The Structure of a Scientific Revolution, describes what he called paradigms and paradigm shifts, which seem to me to be much like the turns in the humanities and social sciences, the linguistic turn, the historical turn, the postmodern turn, the critical turn. I begin most of my doctoral seminars now with Kuhn's book because it's so important to understand that systems of thought can be so different they can't be reconciled. I know this very well, having spent too much time trying to talk with people who will never hear me. And I've given up the romantic idea that if we just dialogue long enough, we can talk across our differences and reach consensus. I've also learned the full weight of what Laurel Richardson taught me at Ohio State, that after you've made a turn, you can't go back to where you were, even if you want to. Scholars in all sorts of disciplines experience this profound shift. In the September 30 issue of the New Yorker, some letters were published from the neurologist Oliver Sacks, whom some of you may remember, who wrote to a friend in 1970 about the resistance one must fight to find new ideas. So much emotion, he wrote, so much attachment goes with the old, and one feels like a murderer when one must smash down one set of ideas to make room for a new set. And the new ideas, the new system of thought, might well be incommensurable with the previous dominant normalized system of thought. Thomas Kuhn, referring to the natural sciences, explained that the theories, concepts, and practices of the dominant or normal scientific paradigm work just fine until they don't. Until some scientists, usually new people, identify an anomaly, something the paradigm can't explain. That anomaly can cause a shift from the dominant paradigm to a different one, which is incommensurable with the previous paradigm. Now, the new paradigm doesn't represent progress, getting closer and closer to the truth about things. In other words, the paradigm shift doesn't reflect incrementalism. The foundationalists believe that knowledge steadily accumulates. Rather, it enables a different world altogether. Kuhn wrote that after a paradigm shift, the scientist works in a different world. What happens to the scientist unable to make the shift? Kuhn wrote the following. And Max Planck, the famous German physicist, surveying his own career in his book, The Scientific Autobiography, sadly remarked that a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. I think that holds true in the social sciences too, that it's very difficult for us to escape our training, very difficult to put what has become normal and dogmatic aside and entertain a system of thought irreconcilably different from our own. But I think Kuhn's work in the natural sciences helps those of us in the social sciences understand that conceptual orders, systems of thought, paradigms are historical and therefore contingent, that they become dominant and then lose their explanatory power for one reason or the other. No system of thought can secure its truth against the anomaly, against difference. A few weeks ago, I read in the New York Times that another fundamental truth in physics has been overturned. Once again, physics must reinvent itself, but that's not unusual in physics. I wish our soft social sciences were as willing to do the same. I worry that some social science disciplines, which are in fact paradigms behind, trap us, especially our students. In his 1979 book about postmodernism, Leotard warned that we are all stuck in the positivism of this or that discipline of learning. I think we still are. I want to shift now to talk for a bit about logical empiricism or logical positivism, one of the three empiricisms I wrote about in my paper because it's so prevalent in the social sciences. I won't repeat what I wrote in that paper, but I do want to remind you of a few of its tenets that are particularly problematic. The first is a belief in a unified science, that the methods of the hard natural sciences can be used in the soft social sciences. A second is that the task of science is to discover existing laws and regularities that can be found in both the natural and the social worlds. A third is that using causal relations and context-free theories, social scientists can predict what will happen. A fourth is that language can be precise and clear and represent things in the empirical world. In other words, a word can be brute, not subject to further interpretation. A fifth belief is incrementalism, the idea that knowledge steadily accumulates but can have gaps that science must fill. A sixth is a reliance on procedural methodology and mathematical measurements that can also be precise and brute. Most importantly, logical empiricism rejects metaphysics, whatever is non-observable, non-measurable, speculative, and critical. Once you study logical empiricism, you recognize it and its concepts and practices everywhere because it's become normalized and imperceptible. It's the mother tongue of the social sciences. For example, when someone talks about gaps in knowledge, you recognize positivism. Or when someone believes words in interview transcripts and field notes can be precise and brute and can perfectly represent empirical reality, when they believe words can be coded, that a word can code another code, for example, another word, for example, you recognize positivism. When researchers want to measure things that can't be measured, like intelligence or happiness, you recognize positivism. When everything, including people, must be quantified, you recognize positivism. Again, positivists value only scientific knowledge, not philosophical, narrative, or descriptive or ethnographic knowledge. Again, they want a social physics, a social science based on empirical evidence that is as hard as physics. However, physicists themselves now report that physics is breaking with centuries of philosophical tradition of defining scientific knowledge as empirical. Today, our most ambitious science can seem at odds with the empirical methodology that has given the field of physics its credibility. This is where the specter of an evidence-independent science arises. If physics no longer requires empirical evidence, what happens to the empirical social sciences so eager to be like physics? Did we have it wrong all the time? Many think we did. As early as the 1950s, some social scientists understood that what we've learned from the physicists is that the methods which scientists or men fascinated by the natural sciences have so often tried to force upon the social sciences were not necessarily those which the scientists in fact followed in their own field, but rather those they believed they employed. In other words, positivist social scientists continue to copy a physics that doesn't exist, a simulacrum. All that smacks of scientism, the worship of science, the belief that the only knowledge that counts is knowledge produced by science. But we see scientism everywhere in the social sciences. Everything must be a science, social science, education science, health science, food science. The list goes on and on. George Steinmetz, a sociologist, echoed Lyotard and called positivism the epistemological unconscious of sociology, and I would add of the social sciences more generally. Some of us here today, particularly those in education, participated in a battle against positivism when the No Child Left Behind Act of 2000 mandated positivist research methodology in federal law in the form of randomized controlled trials, supposedly the gold standard of what it calls scientifically based research and education. NCLB also authorized the new Institute of Education Sciences to replace the Office of Educational Research and Innovation, and appointed Grover Whitehurst, an educational psychologist trained in psychometrics, a positivist discipline, as its first director. Soon after his appointment, Whitehurst dismantled educational research, withholding federal funding from any research that was not positivist. We learned later that postmodern had become a code word for research that was not positivist. Any research, including descriptive, ethnographic, qualitative, but also any kind of critical emancipatory research focused on race, class, gender, sexuality, and so on. Many educational researchers in the room today resisted the positivism of NCLB in special issues of journals and conference presentations, but Whitehurst made it clear that his agency would fund only research that, as he wrote, quote, has high consideration of use, that is practical, that is applied, that is relevant to practitioners and policymakers. He quoted a school superintendent who said that less than 1% of educational research is meaningful for teachers, and who also said, I don't want theories, teachers need strategies, practices. The logic supported Whitehurst's goal to find what works in schools. So we only funded randomized controlled trials, starving other research and education that he claimed was not scientific. I have to pause here and bring Zadie Smith, the marvelous fiction writer, into this relentlessly grim and positivist picture of a system of thought, a conceptual order that refuses philosophy and theory, a theory that claims to be theory-free and wants to measure, predict, and control everything. In an interview reported last week in the Washington Post, Zadie Smith said she doesn't have a big library like many writers because she doesn't hang on to many books. She discards them when she no longer needs them for a project. She puts them out on her stoop and they soon disappear. But she said, philosophy books tend to stay because they're useful. She does not discard philosophy. Clearly, Zadie Smith and Grover Whitehurst live in different, and I would argue, incommensurable worlds. Before I close, I want to get back to something I said in my September 9 lecture about the qualitative methodology I studied as a doctoral student in the early 1990s. I said it seemed new and radical. It was indeed part of the interpretive turn away from the 20th century's versions of positivism, promising a breath of fresh air. But I don't think qualitative methodology was able to rid itself of positivist ideas and concepts then, and I think it has tightened up its positivist tendencies in the decades following NCLB and the scientifically based research debacle. As I've said, I was relieved that I could use qualitative instead of quantitative methodology for my dissertation research. But as soon as I began to try to use it to do it, I found it impossible because thinking with Bogdan and Bicklin here, its methodology, its theory of knowledge, its philosophical commitments, and its techniques and practices, its methods, included features of both interpretivism and positivism, which I believe are incommensurable. More seriously, I think it's muddled empiricism. Where's Amos? Thanks for the adjective muddled, Amos. More seriously, I think it's muddled empiricism was completely inadequate in the face of the richness and density of the empirical world, what William James called the big, blooming, buzzing confusion of reality, whatever that is. I found it impossible and absurd to try to limit my study to the empirical data I could collect using so-called empirical methods. What I learned is that qualitative methodology was neither philosophical enough nor empirical enough. I know I'm not the only one who has had to prune and purge their studies in order to present their research as a whole, unified and coherent body to meet the standards of objectivity and validity of a field. I watch doctoral students try to do that all the time. In my dissertation research, the empirical world of the senses, whatever that means, tore the study apart, especially as I wrote, erupting in every sentence, flinging words at each other, demanding its privilege. The empirical world of the senses simply could not be contained in the methodology chapter of my dissertation where it belonged, but was in every sentence I wrote and in every sentence I wrote about philosophy. That old stubborn epistemological binary that pits the rational against the empirical and extends to pit the philosophical against scientific can be devastating, but can also be refused. Again, I would argue that our pre-existing, humanist, empirical social science research methodologies, positivist or not, are impoverished, neither philosophical enough or empirical enough to account for the too big and the too much, the extravagance of the world. The empirical social sciences seem especially puny and even irrelevant to me now in the face of the real post-human that's coming our way with every fire and flood, a world without humans. The world at the beginning of the scientific revolution in the 1600s with Bacon and Locke and Hume invented their new empiricism is not the world we live in now. And the limitations of the rational, empirical, philosophy, science binaries are increasingly dangerous and I think even unethical. People ask me whether post-qualitative inquiry is philosophical or empirical, whether it belongs to philosophy or to social science, but that's not a good question, as I'm sure you know. Empiricism is, after all, a philosophical concept. I would say that all forms of inquiry are enabled by philosophies, systems of thought, conceptual orders, and how can any kind of inquiry escape the empirical world we live in? Those old binaries just don't work. But the empiricisms of post-qualitative inquiry must align with other concepts in its conceptual order. That is, they must align with post-structural descriptions of reality, ontology, materiality, and so on. Given that post-structuralism refuses logical empiricism and phenomenology, so does post-qual. Because Deleuze's transcendental empiricism does align with post-structuralism, it also aligns with post-qual. But I expect there are or will be other empiricisms which might as well. And we have to remember that these concepts, philosophy, science, epistemology, rationalism, empiricism, ontology, materialism, reality, and so on, are just words invented, redescribed, and abandoned in different systems of thought, words we use to try and capture the too big and the too much, to divide it up, manage and control it, to tame the wild confusion of existing things. With all our words and the hard eyes and odd antics of the empirical investigator, we swoop down on the world like a bird of prey, always fearful of the epistemological threat of that which escapes our knowledge, the anomaly that will shatter all the familiar landmarks of our thought. As for me, I'm hoping a paradigm shift away from the impoverished empiricisms of what the anthropologist Kathleen Stewart called the horrible social sciences. My scholarly contribution to that shift and my politics is post-qualitative inquiry, which is enabled by post-structural critiques of whatever seems, as Foucault wrote, fixed, necessary, unchangeable. My politics also includes encouraging the younger generation and others perhaps too undisciplined for their disciplines to draw attention to existing anomalies and produce others that force the turn, force the paradigm shift. As I recommended earlier, practice deconstruction. Just press on whatever you've been told is real and true, indisputable, rock solid, settled once and for all. Just press on it, and it will stutter and shiver and fly off. Then your work in a different order of things can begin. Thank you. We thought we'd change the order just a bit today, and I would try to answer maybe one or two questions that came up at the end of the September 9 lecture. We don't have a lot of time, so I think I'm just going to tackle one. And it's a big question, and it has different instantiations. And it's like, what do I do if I'm working in this particular system of thought, say post-qualitative, post-structuralism, doing post-qualitative inquiry, and yet I'm constantly coming up against a different system of thought. And I would say that in education, for example, particularly in schooling, we're coming up against the effects of decades now of logical positivism that were caused by NCOV and the focus on evidence-based everything. You have to have data to do everything. I don't think there's an answer to this. The post-structuralists would never tell us what to do. If you read Derrida and all those French guys, they will never tell you what to do. They wouldn't give you an alternative because they said this work is local. It's so local. I can't give you a general answer for anything. I think the important thing for us is to understand that there are different systems of thought, and to try to figure out which one you're dealing with. Are you in schools and dealing with positivism? You can hear it and you can recognize it. Whether you can intervene in it is another story. I think it depends so much on the personal relations, whether people are ready to think differently, whether they want to, how invested they are in whatever they're doing, and if they're really invested in it, are they willing to consider something different? If they're not, don't beat your head on the wall. I mean, you know, how far can you go? How far can you change something if people don't want to listen? My experience was that was with scientifically based research and education. And I know that we wrote conference papers, organized conference sessions, wrote conference papers, published many specials of issues of journals to fight back against positivism. At that point, we went to Washington, D.C. and talked to the big players, and they just completely blew us off. So actually, I think it was in 2010, Patty Lather came here to give a talk, and I remember meeting with our qualitative faculty, and we kind of sat there. We were all exhausted. We've been fighting for 9 years against positivism. And Patty said something like, I think we're all pretty crappy. And we were exhausted. We had been trying to talk across differences to people who didn't want to listen. And so at that point, I just thought, I'm going to do my work. I'm going to do my work. 2 years later, I wrote a paper called Post Qualitative Inquiry, and that began my work. I don't know that I could have done that if I hadn't tried to have that battle against positivism. All of that taught me something, and those of you who are doing that work every day are learning something. Whether you can make a difference is very individual and very local. Something that works today won't work tomorrow, and I think you have to do your analysis on site on that day and think about how to intervene if you even can. So there are no answers to this. I do have to read you a sentence, though. This might make you feel better. This year, I was lucky to be the external examiner of a doctoral student in New Zealand, an educator. The first sentence of her dissertation is this: post-structural theory has informed my professional practice in secondary schools for over 25 years. Can you imagine a school teacher writing that in this country? Post-structural theory has informed my professional practice in secondary schools for over 25 years. So I think that tells you something, that what we have created in this country in schooling is local, specific, it's political, because certain people have power, they're trained in a certain way, they impose their normal theory on everybody else. So anyway, you folks have had many questions. We'll try to get to them sooner or later, but we might not. So send them to us, and we'll try to talk about them at some point. And I think now
we're going to move to guests here, and our, what are we calling this? Our backboard
conversation.
Backboard conversation. We need 3 chairs today.
We'll give them.
Are they in?
I'm gonna give this flower to Betty now. I was having internal, external with me. External with Betty. I'm just gonna have a conversation because I feel like your lecture address, as you were like, she answered all of her questions. So, and we'll use these questions as like as a guide to have So Dr. St.Pierre,
Betty.
Betty, okay, Betty. You talked a little bit about the importance of understanding the history of, say, your topic or concepts. And you caution emerging scholars against rushing to the doing, right? Why is it critical for emerging scholars, graduate students to study the history of their topics, such as empiricism, rather than simply applying or using concepts and methods directly in their research endeavors?
I think I read enough Foucault early on and as a doctoral student to understand the importance of history. Foucault taught me that the way things are is not the way they're meant to be, but just the way they are. And that there's a history, a genealogy to the present. That we need to understand the history of the present. How did things get where they are? Foucault's work is very historical. He had two approaches, genealogy and archaeology, that he used in his work. And if you read his work, I think you begin to understand the importance of not accepting the way things are as the way they were meant to be or the way they should be, but that it's just the way it has turned out. And once you understand that, then you understand that they could be different. They have been different. They could be different. They are different in different historical periods and different countries, and so on. So, and the other part of that that works for me is like deconstruction. And that is that any concept, any idea, any theory that becomes dominant has to immediately be put under erasure. That means look at it, take it seriously, press on it, push on that thing that seems necessary, and see what happens to it. If you really look at it, if you study the history, if you read how it developed over time, I'm always thinking, you know, when we read Descartes in a lot of my classes too, and I always say, boy, if I'd been reading I would have said, don't publish it. You know, how did Descartes' book get published and become so dominant instead of Spinoza, you know, who's writing at the same time? So, you know, this is a kind of a crapshoot, guys. And it's politics and it's power. It's not the truth necessarily. So that's what Foucault taught me and Derrida, the post-structuralists. Don't take anything that exists as right or normal or given. It's just the way things have turned out, and we can change it. We can change it.
So on that note, given the importance of historical understanding in research, given what you shared about genealogy and archaeology, how should research curricula be structured to ensure that emerging scholars are adequately prepared to appreciate and apply these foundational insights?
Well, I think I've written some about this. I wrote a paper on curriculum, like curriculum for Post Qualitative Inquiry. I think that was for the Journal of Curriculum Theorizing. So I would ask students to read philosophy and theory for a couple years, like they do in other countries, you know, and in New Zealand, for example, read philosophy and theory and find something that, I mean, I think everybody has something they're interested in. I mean, I think everybody's got a topic. It's not that you're looking for a topic. You probably got too many topics, things you're just confused about and you want to know more about. Deleuze said, you know, something in the world forces us to think. Masumi called it a shock to thought. Karen Barad says the world kicks back. So something is happening that's bothering you or concerning you or provoking you, and you want to know more about it. But I'm not sure that the way to learn more about it is to drop down in a pre-existing methodology and just follow the recipe. I mean, I think that you can do that for sure, but I want all of us to read more and to have a sense of what some of these big historical systems of thought in Western thought. That's where we live. And if we have time, then we could leave the West and maybe go to the East and study some other systems of thought that we just don't even know exist. So, you know, what does empiricism look like for, empiricism is just a word and it's got so many descriptions. So read a lot of philosophy, read a lot of theory, just follow the trail, follow the citational trail. Start somewhere and just keep reading. Find people to read with you. And I think you'll find ideas and ways of thinking and approaches to inquiry that work for whatever you're interested in. So I would prefer that doctoral students do read for a couple years and then figure out what they want to do. I mean, I think you've already begun. The doctoral students I work with often have had a couple of other careers. They're already experts. They come to us with all sorts of expertise and experience. And I think we often just say, put that aside, take these methodology courses and just follow the methodology and produce a dissertation at the end. And just ignoring whatever they've already got. So I would just like to see a completely different curriculum in the social sciences where we read for a couple of years, figure out what you want to do to get the PhD, and do what makes sense with your advisor and a committee, people who like what you're doing, so on.
I mean, on that note of like read, because I know when I was a grad student taking your classes, that was one piece of advice that I really clung on to, and it's actually in my dissertation. Betty told me to read and read and read some more. So like I've been sharing that advice with my own grad students too. And you explained how reading leads to writing for you in your talk today. And so, you know, I just wanted you to kind of talk to us more about that. Like, do you go back and reread some of your things, or how do you decide, you know, once you read something, like how do you decide what to read next? So what did that process look like?
Well, Dr. Sharma in the workshop this morning, if you remember, Dr. Sharma referred to Judith Butler to help us understand embodiment. Remember that?
Yes.
And so when I got home, I immediately emailed Ajay and said, so what Butlers were you talking about? And so he said 2 books and 1 journal article. Well, I had read them, but now I've got to reread them. So that's how something, so, you know, I want to be as smart as Dr. Sharma right now. I mean, gosh, that makes me great. His
That was
answer
great.
wasn't that
That was
good.
good.
So I want to be able to rip that answer off like that. So I got to read Judith Butler now. But I've also got a couple of books that Dr. Kuntz recommended in September, What Comes After Entanglement. And then I have Dr. Ron Vogue's book called Thinking with Deleuze, which I keep reading at, and I read at it. I reread many texts, many texts, always finding something different depending on the project. I remember reading The Order of Things. I think there's a group of students reading that really hard book right now, The Order of Things. And the last time I read it, I was really looking for ontology. So I think I have a piece of paper and ontology, page 2, ontology, you know. So every time I read something, I'm reading it for something else, or I find something else. So I think rereading is overlooked. It's not quantity necessarily. It's about finding those books that are provocative. Come back to them over and over again.
I'm just like making connections now, but like, you know, when you say most of the grad students, I mean, I did it too. Like we drop down into a method, pre-existing method, and then it kind of sets the course for how we do dissertation. But I want to share that when you, you know, when you advise us and guided us to like read and read, I sometimes took that as like, I was reading some of the transcripts of my conversations with my participants. I was just reading them without jumping into the action of coding the data. And so I just want to share if anyone's like, you know, like, so how do we do this data analysis differently? Like, that's one of the, like, I kind of like took that advice and put that into the space of like analysis when I was working on my dissertation, that like, I was just reading and reading and reading and thinking through whatever I had. Right, so I just made that connection, so, anyways, yeah. Do we have time? Is anyone keeping track of time?
I'm supposed to be.
We can.
Yeah.
Not to be an undisciplined, I don't know, someone too undisciplined for this discipline. Could you elaborate on the danger of what happens when logical empiricism runs rampant in educational contexts, such as No Child Left Behind, and it's, by the way, we call it Nickelby. Yeah, we gave it, we got a Nickelby, yeah.
Okay.
Nicholas,
We talked about
Nicholas,
that
we
later.
call it Nicholas. Bad.
I think it's already happened.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what happens next. Public education has just been positivized. It's been psychologized. It's been scientized. It's been mathematized, you know, all in the name of figuring out what works. They can figure out how to teach fractions in this fifth grade classroom, then we can scale it up and we can have every fifth grade teacher in the country doing this. I mean, that's just the most absurd thing you can imagine. Having data rooms in schools, I mean, this is just absurd. Teachers are stalling out and quitting. Enrollment in colleges of education is dropping like crazy. Who wants to teach in that kind of environment? I think about it sometimes, it's crashing and burning, and how bad does it have to get before we do something different? This is politics, folks. This is politics and power. So how do we hasten the paradigm shift? I don't know. But you do get a chance to vote. And, which is when next,
A week from today, the early voting
Very-
begins in Athens, Georgia, in case you wanted to
a
know.
week from today, what's that date?
15th. Is it a week from today? Tomorrow, a week from tomorrow.
Okay, a week from tomorrow,
Linden House.
Linden House.
Just in
So we'll
case.
see you all there.
I'll be there.
I don't know what teachers can do. I don't know. I mean, parents have a lot more power than teachers, so I don't know. But I think I think it's gone. I remember when one of my wonderful doctoral students, who was a high school English teacher for 25 years, said, "Betty, I now have to teach evidence-based writing." Evidence-based writing, and I thought, evidence-based writing, that's it. Positivist writing. No poetry, no narrative, no. We out of time, Dr. Freeman?
Do we have maybe a question that we want? I'm sorry to take that.
Well, I have a question that maybe I would address to all of you that comes back to something that Betty talked about, the exhaustion that you all felt. No Child Left Behind came out and multiple positivism. And so the question that came from Zoom was about what we're facing now, censorship, don't say gay, no DEI, no CRT. And so is there anything besides exhaustion that we might, I want to open it to everyone, that we might do at this time and thinking with Post Qualitative Inquiry and with instructions?
We're still here. We're still having these conversations. We're still trying. And I think that to me, even if I have moments of exhaustion, moments where I'm like, oh my gosh, how many times do I have to say this in slightly different ways in order to like become legible in some ways to those in power? Like we're all still trying. And I think that to me is the fundamental engine that keeps me from falling into hopeless exhaustion, that we can still even have these words, you know, we're not in a full out Orwellian double speak situation yet. And I think the community too, of like not feeling like I'm totally alone in this fight is what powers me on to continue with this engine metaphor.
I think, I'm in Ohio, and there are certain words that we now can't say, but I lean into my training, and, like what Betty actually said in her talk. So like, for example, when I need to discuss like issues of equity, that's a very unsafe place for me to talk about it explicitly in my classes, right? But I do go back to my training, when I read Latour's work, he always, he suggests like it's all about the local, right? So then when I really, so like when things feel like it's too big and like this equity word is looming over me and I can't say that, then I really lean into like what's going on in my local, the right? So what's happening with my students? So and I try to make the word equity, I don't have to say that out loud, but I can embody and enact what it means to be a good teacher, right? And then I don't have to say the word equity. And I can share this example with a lot of passion because one of my student teachers who was very conservative and was secretly recording all of my classes and was zooming in, and there was her father is a police officer and her boyfriend was a police officer, and they were always in that space listening in to watch me like catch me to say that. But I have to say, like, I really focused on like what's happening with my students, what can I do and with my students. And at the end of the semester, I have to say, like, she came up to me and she said, thank you for not shoving down the word equity down my throat. Number one, I've never said that word. But she articulated that. She said, of course, I'm going to be a good teacher for all of my students. I didn't realize that's what you were asking me to do, but now I could, like, now I'm kind of stepping away from all of this. And she did a hand wave, and I'm like, so that kind of gave me like an anchoring point as to like my students need a place to kind of anchor their ideas too, and kind of, again, like really leaning into my training from reading Latour to like make it local, right? So like, yeah, so that's been kind of a saving, that's been kind of guiding me, and it's been working. So, and also having that community, yeah, with other.
You want to answer that question and
I mean, it depends on where you're working. I mean, I'm really lucky that I'm in academia and I can kind of go home and read my books and write my papers and but there's a different kind of politics and a different resistance in academia, and all this stuff hits us sooner or later. What's in the schools comes to us, and I think it's a matter of finding a community, finding people you can talk to, organizing to do things. I highly recommend, organizing conference sessions. That's a good place to vent your stuff, and people who come to your session are likely to be like you and meet people and get things going. Special issues of journals, on topics. That's the work we do in academia, and it's political and it makes a difference, I think, over time. So whatever you're good at, do that wherever you are.
And on that note, I would like to thank everybody. Thank you. Thank you, everybody online for, participating. We did that, and
Thank you.